This is an interesting image. It's a lithograph of the burning of Richmond at the end of the Civil War. When you look at it, what do you see? You see a capital city on fire, warehouses burning, ammunitions exploding in the night, bridges in flames, civilians fleeing across the southern bridge. If you showed this picture to anyone, most anyone at all, they'd tell you exactly what it looked like. It looks like an invading army has shelled the city, laid siege to it, sacked it. That's what it looks like. That's what it has to be. Except no army ever shelled Richmond. No siege guns ever fired. The Union Army wasn't even in the city when this happened. In fact, in the entire course of the Civil War, Union artillery never fired a single shell into Richmond proper. At all. Not one. So who burned the Confederate capital to the ground? We're told the Confederacy did it to itself, on purpose, with its own people still inside over the course of a couple days. Here's the story as we've been told it. Here's what they say. On the night of April 2nd, 1865, General Grant breaks through the Confederate lines at Petersburg to the south, opening the road to Richmond. Confederate President Jefferson Davis gets the news in the middle of a church service. By that night, he and his cabinet are on a train heading south. The government is gone. The man left holding the city is General Richard Ewell, and Ewell has standing orders. If Richmond falls, burn the supplies, the tobacco, the cotton, the food warehouses, the munitions. Don't let any of it fall into Union hands. So that night, the fires are lit. The bridges are destroyed. The arsenal is blown up. And then, we're told, the wind shifted. The wind always shifts. The fires spread out of control. By morning, 35 city blocks are gone. More than 800 buildings destroyed. And here's the strange ending. When Union troops marched in the next morning, they didn't arrive as conquerors of a city they destroyed. They arrived as firemen. And they put the fires out. 2 days later, we're told, Abraham Lincoln walks the smoking streets with his young son. 5 days after that, Lee surrenders at Appomattox. 5 days after that, Lincoln is dead at Ford's Theater. And up in New York, the printing firm of Currier and Ives takes the destruction of an American capital city and sells it, mass-produced, hand-colored, an affordable decoration for your living room wall. That's the official account. Now let's start asking some basic questions. Why destroy your capital city and population when up until now it has survived the war? Burning your supplies is a battle tactic. Burning your entire capital city to the ground isn't a battle tactic. You do it when you're losing the city during a fight. The battle is what creates the destruction. You do it to starve the enemy of resources. But there was no fight. They weren't denying the enemy anything. We are told they were just leaving. Burning a city is what a battle does, not a retreat. The official reason centers on tobacco warehousing. But think about that. Tobacco isn't a military supply. You can't fire a cannon with it. You can't feed an army with it. Tobacco is money, stored wealth. Burning it didn't deny the Union a weapon. It destroyed an economic asset, which is exactly what you'd expect an invading army to do, or something you would accuse an invading army of doing. And what about the food? When mobs broke into the warehouse that night, we're told they discovered something, hidden stockpiles of food in a city where people were starving. Food the government had been sitting on the whole time. And why burn those bridges? Why burn the southern bridges? The Union Army arrived the next morning from the north, completely unimpeded. The burning bridges didn't slow the enemy down by a single hour, not even a single minute. What they did do was trap civilians on the wrong side of a burning city, which is something a hostile invading army would do, or you would at least accuse it of doing. And then where's the smoke? If you look at the photographs taken in the days after, and they're dated, they're immediately after, there's no smoke. There's no smoldering. Nothing. A town this size, a city this size, if it burned, it would smoke for weeks, if not longer. The only place you ever see smoke is in the hand drawings, the hand-drawn images. And the last question, which is hard because we want to pick a side. But what about the men, the leaders? Here's what we're being asked to believe. That the Confederate commanders, men who had fought and held the line for 4 years, men whose soldiers were still in the field, panicked. Torched their own capital, burned food their own starving people needed, and destroyed bridges that trapped their own civilians in the flames. You don't have to agree with their cause to see the problem. These were experienced, disciplined soldiers. And the story asks us to believe they behaved like frightened children against their own people for zero strategic gain. So put the whole story in one breath. A government that knew the war was lost deliberately burns its own capital that had survived the war, destroys food its starving citizens needed, burned wealth it could have bargained with, blew up its own arsenal with its own troops still nearby, destroyed bridges that hurt no one but its own people, and fled as cowards after 4 years of combat. And they fled south, towards the breakthrough. That's the official account. It's backward. If you spent any time in old world research, you felt this before. This is the classic contradiction that's found. The story is wrong somehow. The timeline is wrong somehow. The buildings don't match. Either they're too grand or they're too blown up. You may not have a name for it. I haven't found a name for it. So I created one. I call it backward causality. It's what happens when a history's or historical narrative has to be built in reverse. The outcome is real, physical, visible, undeniable. A city in ruins, a building that couldn't exist in the same timeline. The explanation comes after, worked out backwards, from the ending to invent a cause. And backwards causality leaves fingerprints. We can examine them. There's 5 of them, like the fingers on a hand. I'm not going to argue about thumbs. Once you learn to see them, you'll find them a valuable tool in old world research. The first I call implausible foresight. This is when the invented motive only works in hindsight because it was written after the outcome it explains. Richmond's destruction included the food stores of a starving city and the tobacco wealth it needed to survive what came next. So the deny the enemy supplies motive asks you to believe leaders deliberately chose their own people's ruin, a decision no one makes forward in time, only backward on paper. The second is called repurposed imperative. This is when a borrowed authority or decision or something is stretched over the outcome because no real authority ever existed. The burning of Richmond is justified by a 3-year-old statute written for active siege conditions. Pressed into service for an unopposed evacuation it was never written for because it was the only law available to retrofit. Post hoc explanations, the next one. This is when the paperwork supporting the story is dated after the outcome was already established. Here, every detail of how the burning was authorized and carried out. Supposedly, General Lee sent an order, relocated the tobacco, and making sure that the fire departments were standing by. But all of this traces to only one source. Ewell's own letter, written 8 months after the city was in ash, describing an order that no archive can produce. The next one's the convenient failure. This is when an accident is added to the story. I remember doing the research on San Francisco, and there was a night where people were running around with dynamite trying to blowing buildings up to put a fire out. It doesn't make any sense. They do this because the invented motive can't justify the actual scale of the outcome. Here, a burn supposedly prepared for 6 weeks, safe building selected, fire department's position, somehow consumed 35 blocks, and 800 buildings, where every safeguard fails in one direction only, maximum destruction. And that happens because the destruction was already there. It was the fixed point the story had to reach. And the last one's the directional gap. This is when the missing records are precisely the ones that would verify the story, while the records that merely assert it all survive. In this case, it's Lee's written order, the document at the top of the chain, the one that would prove the burning was authorized. It exists in no archive. It has never been produced. No one has ever seen it. The only thing that survives is Ewell's letter 8 months later insisting that it once did survive, or once did exist. Now, not every backward narrative has all 5 markers, but the fall of Richmond has all 5. And understand what backward causality does and doesn't claim. It doesn't say the destruction never happened. Richmond was ruined. That's real. What it defines is the direction of the story, when the narrative only works if you start at the end and build backwards. All of those buildings we see with short timelines, or events purpose that miraculously fit a need no one could have seen. When every explanation is a retrofit, when the paperwork shows up late and the plan fails spectacularly in exactly the right way. When you see that, you're not reading history. You're reading a cover story. The outcome came first, the story came after. So everything you've just seen, the framework, the markers, the pattern, this is the current state of old world research. It's where it stands today. Thousands of hours of videos, dozens of books, a whole community pulling at these same threads, whether they had a name for it or not. But this is where I want to go further, because backwards causality can show you the seams in a cover story. It can tell you the official account was built in reverse, but what it can't tell you is what actually happened.